The environmental is the biggest tool for stopping growth, the biggest tool. The other is regulation. I look at some of I know the environmental stuff better because I had to build buildings in New York. I had to do environmental impact studies. And I would see some of these guys that I'd hire for a lot of money, environmentalists that would get you through the process. And they'd be up in Albany, that's the capital of New York, and they're up there trying to make it tougher for guys like me that were builders because they'd get paid more money.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Open Minds Show. I'm your host, Christopher Balkerin. Folks, Donald Trump was on the Joe Rogan Experience, and he covered a lot of topics. One topic in particular, which I think both the right and the left may find some agreement on, is with regards to environmental regulations slowing down development projects. In fact, I think the reason why I believe both might find agreement is because these projects provide tens of thousands of jobs specifically to underrepresented groups, which I'll discuss in a moment. But here's a clip of the former president on Joe Rogan's podcast.
I had one guy, highly recommended. I was good at getting permits. I was one of the kings of. I was always very good, but the environmental stuff was always horrible. They could slow a project down 10 years, 15 years. I had a project in Louisiana, built big LNG plant. It was for 14 years. It was going to cost $18 billion, one of the biggest, like the Empire State Building, laying down on its side times 4. Massive on the coast, on the Gulf Coast. And they said, sir, they're going to give it up. I said, they shouldn't give it up. What's the problem? They can't get their environmental. They had environmental permits that would fill this whole room up to the ceiling. And they said there was one mistake on one little line. They want him to do it all over again. It's not going to happen.
Now, what's interesting here is Trump takes quite a moderate stance. He understands that environmental laws are necessary, but it's frequently used as a tool to block development entirely. And it just gets me thinking about a broader debate on the impact of regulatory processes that slow projects down or even stop them completely. There are many examples. One Trump uses is the Louisiana LNG export plant. It was originally proposed as a means to boost U.S. energy independence and create literally thousands of jobs in Louisiana. But the project faced 14 years of regulatory delays tied to environmental assessments. Now, Trump says, and Joe Rogan adequately asks, well, what's the point? What's the cost of this? Well, the cost is that millions of dollars were paid in both consulting and legal fees as a result of this 14-year delay, just to meet regulatory requirements. Now, it could be the case that the plant didn't meet the regulatory requirements. But the flip side here is, as a result of the plant not meeting those requirements, no jobs were created. And you'd think with such a large project, there would be this symbiotic relationship between the government and LNG to get the plant created. And the reason I say that is because there's no real other tool that governments have to create tens of thousands of jobs in very specific communities across the country. They have to rely on the private sector to do so. So you think the government's interest here would be to facilitate job creation, because tens of thousands of people employed means tens of thousands of income tax that would then be generated in that area. And so it's not just the LNG power plant, in Louisiana. Here in Canada, we've seen all types of projects that have faced delays, including the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, remember, this was initially projected to create 42,000 direct and indirect jobs. And this specifically included positions for First Nations, Métis, Inuit, Indigenous workers whose communities were located closer to the pipeline's route. And this was seen as a path to economic independence. Now, I go back to my earlier point. What other tool would the government have to employ First Nations, Métis, Inuit community members in and around the Keystone XL pipeline path? There's probably no other tool that the government could use to do so. And as a result of this, community members are faced to leave their communities altogether because there are no jobs, or there are fewer job opportunities closer to their communities. So many times, workers go to bigger cities, different provinces, heck, even outside Canada, just to get better job opportunities. And this forces a lot of Indigenous community members away from their communities. And I find this fascinating because this is the intersection between economic development and prosperity, which, a lot of people say is very capitalist driven, job creation. And what many on the left have argued for many years, or continue to argue, which is, making sure folks are closer to their communities, closer to home, so that, they can be closer to their family members and community, etc. And, having Indigenous community members in particular be closer to their communities could allow for more economic development and prosperity inside their communities themselves. And so what's also interesting is that a lot of these pipelines run in communities that currently have high unemployment rates and limited access to other job prospects. And so for many, they were counting on local contracting jobs. And then its eventual cancellation, Keystone XL's cancellation in 2021, was a major disappointment. And again, it's not just Keystone XL. There's other examples. TMX, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project here in Canada, it faced so many delays due to both environmental regulations and lawsuits brought forward by Indigenous groups and environmental organizations. And that in particular was to create 15,000 jobs in total in Canada. And what's also interesting is that many First Nations communities signed on to TMX. They saw the benefits and they wanted more community members to be employed. And again, I find this interesting. It's the intersection of environmental regulation and environmentalists with many First Nation groups and their leadership saying, well, hang on, if we are consulted in a true partnership and that means jobs for our communities, why would we be against this pipeline? And many pipelines bring billions of dollars in terms not only investments, but billions of dollars in terms of potential growth for decades and decades. And remember, the government of Canada doesn't have many tools, if any, to employ this amount of, in this case, First Nations, Métis, Inuit workers in more rural parts of our country. So, folks, I actually want to ask you all this. Do you think that what Trump is saying specifically on environmental regulations is, in fact, an intersection that both the left and the right have to deal with? In my opinion, it seems like moderate voters would want more pipeline development, more job creation, of course, with respect to both First Nations groups, as well as with respect to environmentalist impact assessments. But ultimately, I think most would want these projects to go through. Having them canceled or delayed by 14, 15 plus years, I don't know if moderates would be in favor of that. In fact, I would argue moderates would not be in favor of that. And so whether you're Democrat or Republican, I feel like environmental impact assessments is something that will continue to be an issue. Do you believe that the regulations are too intense and is not facilitating growth and development? And how would Kamala Harris or Trump handle this going forward? And we as the electorate, how do we ask these questions to our leaders? Perhaps a more innovative approach is to present this to the general public to say, we're not here to, destroy the environment and to disregard First Nations voices in the development of these projects. We're here to work in partnership and collaboration with these groups, but we're certainly not going to get in the way of development either. And so while environmental impact assessments are necessary and First Nations groups agreements are necessary, our end goal should be these projects should move forward as stated, with enough input from as many groups as possible. But let me know what you think. How should governments navigate these complex relationships given everything that is being thrown at the president and at local governments, etc.? How would a Democrat or a Republican handle these, and what would you expect government to do moving forward? Let me know. And again, welcome to the Open Minds Show. I'm your host, Christopher Balkrin. If you haven't already, follow me on TikTok at Christopher Balkrin and on Instagram at openmindspod. Thanks, everyone, and I will catch you in the next one.